In this video, we're going to be talking about meiosis and sexual reproduction. Meiosis is division of cells that produces cells needed for sexual reproduction. So you might remember early in the year, we talked about two types of reproduction, asexual and sexual. So asexual reproduction involves only one parent passing down genetic information, so the offspring is genetically identical to the parent. So this is common in bacteria and protists and fungus, sometimes occurs in plants, and once in a while in animals. So if you look here on the right, this picture is bacteria that's dividing. The bacteria copies their DNA and simply passes on to two new cells. So the new cells are identical to the parents. Here's a rare case of animals dividing by asexual reproduction and producing offspring that way. The sea star loses an arm, and the sea star on the left here will grow back that arm, and then the arm can actually grow back the other missing pieces. So we have two complete sea stars here. They are genetically identical to each other because they're producing new cells by mitosis. So mitosis is the type of division we talked about last week that produces new cells that are identical to the parents. Sexual reproduction, on the other hand, requires the union of cells, the union of genetic information. So we have a combination of genetic material from both parents. So both parents contribute to the offspring, and therefore the offspring is unique. They're different from their parents, but they have a combination of information. This is very common in animals, very typical in animals, insects, and plants even reproduce sexually as well. So pollen, for example, is a reproductive cell. This requires cells to divide by meiosis that produces new cells that are unique. They are not identical to the original cells like we saw in mitosis. It's going to produce diversity not only in the new cells that are made, but in the offspring as well. Diversity is always a positive for any population. So the cells that are made are specialized sex cells called gametes. So in mitosis, we divided cells and made new cells that are called daughter cells. In meiosis, we're producing new cells that are called gametes. So gametes are reproductive cells. Sperm and egg cells are examples of gametes. And gametes are always haploid. Gametes are haploid because they have only half of the set of chromosomes as the parents instead of a full set. So essentially, they have only one of each chromosome instead of two of each chromosome. So in humans, we have 46 chromosomes typically, but in our haploid cells, our sperm and egg cells, we have only one of each and therefore only 23 chromosomes. So gametes are necessary for sexual reproduction because they join to produce that new cell, that zygote that grows into the offspring. So meiosis is that type of division that produces those special reproductive cells. So meiosis consists of two divisions that are going to end up producing 4 new cells. These new cells at the bottom here are haploids. They only have half the chromosomes as a parent, and they are called gametes. Again, meiosis goes through 2 sets of divisions. So meiosis 1 will produce the first pair of cells, and then division 2 will be meiosis 2, and they'll produce the next group of cells. So we have our 2 cells dividing again to make 4 cells. In meiosis 1, there are 4 steps. These steps will sound familiar: prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, but because it's meiosis 1, they're called prophase 1, metaphase 1, anaphase 1, and telophase 1 and cytokinesis. You can see telophase and cytokinesis are coupled here. Cytokinesis, if you remember, is when the cell finally splits. So as you can see in this picture, this is pretty characteristic of meiosis 1. It's a very specific step, but notice chromosomes are separating from each other. It looks a little bit different than what we saw in mitosis. We'll talk about that in a minute. So meiosis 1 is the first nuclear division. Prior to this, the DNA has copied, just like we saw in the S phase of interphase, where DNA is copied, so there's enough DNA for the new cells. When chromosomes are separating from one another, this is very important, homologous chromosomes actually separate. So we see in this picture that chromosome pairs, the entire X, is separating from each other instead of having the chromosomes split up. So meiosis 1 is characterized by the separation of the paired chromosomes to create new cells that have fewer chromosomes. And that's very different than what we saw before. So that would be anaphase 1. So during meiosis 1, those homologous chromosomes will separate from one another after they pair up. So notice they've paired, that's early in the phase, and then they separate from one another, those homologous chromosomes. Remember, homologous chromosomes are matching chromosomes. So the result here is going to be 2 new cells, and they're already haploid. Both of those cells will enter meiosis 2. So meiosis 2 is the second division. These consist of prophase 2, metaphase 2, and anaphase 2, and telophase 2 and cytokinesis. This will look a lot like mitosis that we studied last week, except we're going to have fewer chromosomes now. Notice the chromosomes are splitting up to separate from one another. This is our second nuclear division. So in meiosis 1, we saw homologous chromosomes separate. Now sister chromatids separate like we saw in mitosis. That is the chromosome, the X, actually splitting apart. This is going to produce our 4 cells, because remember, 2 cells are entering this, and each of those will divide into 2 cells. And so now we have 4 new cells, and these are called gametes. So our sperm and egg cells are the resulting cells, our gametes. Now, independent assortment occurs during meiosis, and this is because chromosome pairs are aligning and then separating. So pairs of homologous chromosomes separate from one another, and therefore assort trait information independent of one another. So essentially, traits aren't inherited together. So just because mom has blonde hair and blue eyes, and she passes down the blonde hair, does not mean she has to pass down the blue eyes. The inheritance of those traits is random. So for example, if we only had 4 chromosomes that we were working with, notice we can have possibility 1 here or possibility 2 distribute those chromosomes differently to the offspring. In the case of possibility 1, we have the combinations listed at the bottom here, and then in possibility 2, notice the combinations are different. The traits do not have to be inherited together because they are assorted independent of one another. They are inherited independent of one another. And there's your example. And finally, crossing over. So crossing over is a normal occurrence. It also contributes to genetic variation, which before said is a very positive thing for a population. So crossing over might sound kind of strange. It's when homologous chromosomes actually trade information. And as long as it is a fair trade, an equal trade, then it is fine. You might remember earlier we said that homologous chromosomes pair. That's very early on in meiosis 1. When those homologous chromosomes pair, they can trade pieces of their chromosome. And as long as it's an even trade, then it is fine. It actually contributes to genetic variation. So they're actually going to switch pieces of information. So prophase 1 is when these homologous chromosomes match up and line up. It's kind of like square dancing. They line up next to each other, they align in the middle, and then they separate from one another. And here's where they can trade information. So it's kind of like a shuffling of genes so that when they're passed to the offspring, it's a little bit of a different combination than those parents received. And again, that genetic variation is a positive thing. So here's a kind of a cartoon picture of that. So notice this is chromosome, and here's its matching chromosome. So these two are alike, and therefore they are homologous chromosomes. When they line up next to each other, they are flimsy, flexible structures. They can get tangled and trade pieces. So if you follow the colors here, notice this chromosome piece was red. Now it is red with a little bit of green. So notice they traded pieces here. Okay, notice that green has a piece from the red. So we actually had multiple crossing over events occurring. So now this pair of chromosomes, as it's passed down, will have a different genetic combination than it received from its original parent. So that is the end of our discussion on meiosis. Make sure that you have your notes filled in. There'll be a practice quiz for you to complete. You're allowed to take that multiple times. And then there will also be a quiz at the end of the week, or actually on your own time. You pick the pace, but that is due by the end of the week. So you have 2 assignments to complete. Once you have the content, practice it and review it. There's also a video for you to watch, but you have a practice quiz and a quiz, both of which are graded. Let me know if you have any questions. Good luck.